Malcolm Rivers stood alone, a young black lawyer mocked by a powerful judge, dismissed by veteran attorneys, and doubted by a courtroom full of strangers. But when he unveiled a buried conspiracy documents, recordings, and decades of corruption, the silence that followed was deafening. The man they ridiculed became the voice of a displaced community. And when the judge who once laughed called him a legal genius, the world finally listened. The polished oak of the courtroom gleamed under the soft glow of the chandeliers, a stark contrast to the simmering tension that permeated the air. Every seat in the gallery was filled, a silent, expectant crowd representing the city's press, curious public, and even the hushed whispers of Malcolm Rivers' own neighborhood. At the front, in the stern, elevated chair, sat Judge Edward Langston, his silver hair impeccably combed, his gaze a sharp, piercing blue that swept over the room before settling, with an almost imperceptible sneer. On Malcolm. Malcolm Rivers, barely 30, stood at the defense table, his frame lean but composed, a quiet dignity in his posture that belied the monumental weight of the moment. His tailored suit, though modest, was sharp, and his dark skin, a beacon against the pale marble of the courtroom, seemed to draw every eye. He was a young black lawyer, self-representing in a high-stakes case that had drawn national attention, a decision born not of arrogance, but necessity. After a string of rejections from established firms, whispers of lack of fit echoing the unspoken prejudice he had encountered since law school. His mother, Lena Rivers, a woman whose every sacrifice had paved his path, sat quietly in the back row, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on her son with a mixture of pride and profound anxiety. The proceedings began, and immediately, the air thickened. Judge Langston cleared his throat, a small dismissive sound that seemed to reverberate through the hushed chamber. "Mr. Rivers," the judge began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "you stand before this court, representing yourself, a rather audacious choice for a matter of this magnitude. Wouldn't you agree?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Malcolm met the judge's gaze evenly, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor," he responded, his voice clear and resonant, "I believe that the principles of justice apply equally to all, regardless of who stands at the defense table. My commitment to my client, and to the truth, is unwavering." Langston's thin lips curled into a faint, condescending smile. "Indeed, Mr. Rivers, a noble sentiment, though one might argue a touch naive. Experience, after all, is often a more reliable guide than idealism." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, a thinly veiled insult aimed not at Malcolm's legal argument, but at his very presence, his youth, and his racial background. The opposing lawyers, a duo of seasoned veterans from a prestigious, predominantly white firm, exchanged knowing glances, a hint of smug satisfaction playing on their faces. The jury, a mixed group, shifted uneasily, some avoiding Malcolm's eye, others openly observing the subtle power play. Racial bias in the legal system, though often unspoken, manifested in these microaggressions, the subtle dismissals that chipped away at legitimacy. As Malcolm began his opening statement, his voice steady, his arguments meticulously constructed, Judge Langston interjected with increasingly frequent and pointed questions, often interrupting Malcolm mid-sentence. "Mr. Rivers, are you quite certain you understand the procedural nuances of this court? Your assertions seem lacking in established precedent." He would lean back, a faint smirk playing on his lips, as if relishing Malcolm's discomfort. Each interruption was delivered with a theatrical swallow or a condescending shake of the head, designed to undermine Malcolm's credibility in front of the jury at one point. As Malcolm presented a complex legal argument based on a lesser-known but critical case law, Judge Langston's laughter erupted, a sharp, disbelieving bark that cut through the courtroom's solemnity. It wasn't a sympathetic laugh, but a loud, mocking sound, laced with open contempt. "Mr. Rivers, are you truly attempting to draw parallels from a circuit court ruling of such questionable relevance, he sneered, his eyes glinting with amusement. That's quite an imaginative leap, I must say. Perhaps you mistook this for a debate club, not a court of law. The sound of the judge's laughter hung heavy in the air, a public humiliation that stung Malcolm deeply. Far beyond the legal argument itself, it was a direct assault on his intelligence, his competence, and implicitly, his right to occupy that space, to be taken seriously as a black lawyer in a system that often seemed designed to keep him out. A few members of the public chuckled nervously, swept up in the judge's dismissive tide. Lena Rivers flinched, her hands tightening further, a silent prayer escaping her lips. The opposing lawyers exchanged triumphant grins, their confidence visibly swelling. Malcolm, however, did not waver. He absorbed the ridicule, the sting of the judge's open scorn, and allowed it to fuel a quiet fire within. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his eyes narrowing, but his voice remained calm, devoid of any trace of anger or defensiveness. He simply stated, "Your Honor, with all due respect, the relevance of this precedent will become abundantly clear as we present the full context of our argument and the evidence. I am confident that the jury, in their wisdom, will see the precise parallels." It was a subtle, yet firm, pushback, a refusal to be rattled, even as the judge's eyes bored into him, challenging him to crack. The humiliation was profound, but Malcolm's outward composure was a testament to a resolve forged in countless battles against systemic prejudice. He stood firm, a silent promise in his stance that this public denigration would not define the outcome of the trial. The judge's scornful laughter echoed in the cavernous space of the courtroom, a familiar, acrid taste of humiliation in Malcolm's mouth. It was a sensation he had known intimately since childhood, a bitter undercurrent in the river of his life. He saw his mother, Lena, in the back row, her face etched with concern and a flicker of memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through the present moment. He was 7, a bright-eyed boy with a curious mind, sitting in Mrs. Albright's first-grade class. The teacher, a stern woman with tightly coiffed hair, had called upon him to read a passage aloud. Malcolm, a prodigious reader even then, had stumbled over a word, a rare occurrence. Another boy, Tommy, with a smattering of freckles and a perpetually sneering lip, had snickered. Mrs. Albright, instead of offering encouragement, had sighed theatrically. "Malcolm, darling, perhaps stick to the simpler words. Some things just aren't meant for everyone." Her words, delivered with a condescending pat on his head, were not about his reading ability, but about his perceived place. He had felt the eyes of his classmates, the knowing glances, the unspoken judgment that settled on him like a shroud. Lena had come to school, her spine rigid with indignation, but the incident had been brushed off as a misunderstanding. Malcolm, however, understood. He learned then the weight of unspoken expectations, the subtle ways society could diminish you based on the color of your skin. He had learned to observe, to listen, and to internalize, to understand that sometimes silence was a shield. Years later, in high school, Malcolm had excelled academically, his grades a defiant answer to every implied doubt. He dreamed of law school, of fighting for justice, but the path was fraught with subtle barriers. During his application to a prestigious university, he had aced the entrance exams, submitted a stellar essay, and had glowing recommendations. Yet, during the interview, the admissions dean, a portly man with a benevolent smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, had remarked, "Mr. Rivers, your ambition is commendable, but law, is a very traditional field. It requires a certain presence, a certain established background that takes time to cultivate." The words hung in the air, a coded message. He was admitted, but the implied struggle, the suggestion that he was an outsider, remained. He saw other students, less qualified, glide through with ease, their paths seemingly preordained by family connections and privilege. Malcolm had worked 3 jobs through college, his nights spent poring over textbooks, his days working to pay for tuition and help Lena with bills. He saw the doors that remained closed, the opportunities that simply weren't extended, and he understood the systemic nature of the struggle. He learned that even when you were in, you were still often reminded of your otherness, the most searing memory. However, was during his first year of law school. He had been an eager, brilliant student, often outperforming his peers. Yet, when it came time for summer internships, the most coveted positions, those at the top-tier firms, consistently eluded him. He saw less capable classmates, often sons and daughters of established lawyers, secure positions with ease. One day, a senior partner from a firm he had applied to, a man who had interviewed him personally, had run into him at a university event. "Malcolm," the partner had said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, "you're sharp, very sharp. But let me be frank with you. Our clients, they prefer a certain look, someone who projects a sense of traditional authority. It's not fair, I know, but it's the reality of the business. You'd do well in public defense, perhaps, or community law. Excellent work there, but this isn't for you." The words were a hammer blow, not just to his ambition, but to his spirit. It wasn't about his grades, his intellect, or his work ethic. It was about his skin, his very being. That day, walking home under a darkening sky, a profound realization had settled upon Malcolm. The system wasn't broken when it was designed to exclude, to marginalize, to preserve power within established lines. The quiet insults, the dismissive gestures, the doors subtly closed. They were not random acts of prejudice, but interconnected threads in a pervasive tapestry of discrimination. He could have raged, he could have retreated, but something else ignited within him, a quiet, burning resolve. He would not scream, he would not lash out. He would learn the rules of their game, master them, and use them to dismantle the very barriers that sought to contain him. He would prove them wrong, not with anger, but with an irrefutable display of his capabilities. This resolve had been his shield, his sword, and his unwavering guide. It explained his composure now, in the face of Judge Langston's sneering contempt. He had faced this before, in different forms, with different words, but the underlying message was always the same. You don't belong here. But Malcolm knew he did. He belonged here, not just for himself, but for every other person who had been told they weren't meant for certain spaces, for every dream subtly crushed by systemic prejudice. The courtroom was his battleground, and his weapon was his mind, honed by years of overcoming precisely this kind of insidious dismissal. He would not allow the judge's laughter to break him. He would use it, instead, as the very fuel for his quiet, determined fight. After the sting of the judge's laughter had settled, Malcolm Rivers returned to the present, the hum of the courtroom a stark reminder of the battles he still had to wage. Law school had ended, but the real fight, the one for a place in the legal world, had just begun. Despite his stellar academic record, the doors to prestigious firms, the very ones that had once offered him a whispered dismissal, remained stubbornly shut. He sent out hundreds of applications, each meticulously crafted, highlighting his top-tier grades, his moot court victories, his unwavering dedication. The responses, when they came, were polite rejections, often citing fit or limited openings, phrases that had become thinly veiled code for his race. He tried to live normally, as much as any ambitious young lawyer could. But normalcy in his world was a constant negotiation with systemic barriers. He wasn't overtly denied a job because he was black. Instead, he was subtly overlooked, passed over for less qualified candidates. His name somehow always missing from the shortlist. Networking events, meant to foster connections, often felt like alienating experiences. Malcolm would approach partners from major firms, offer his hand, and introduce himself, only to be met with brief, distracted smiles and quick dismissals, while his white counterparts engaged in lengthy, jovial conversations, their paths seemingly paved with unspoken affiliations. He observed how opportunities were often extended through informal channels, through golf games and private dinners at exclusive clubs he wasn't invited to, reinforcing a subtle, yet impenetrable barrier. Frustrated but undeterred, Malcolm decided to carve his own path. He rented a small, unassuming office in a bustling, diverse neighborhood. Far from the gleaming towers of corporate law, he hung a simple sign, Malcolm Rivers, attorney at law. His first clients were the marginalized, the voiceless, small business owners facing eviction, immigrants struggling with paperwork, individuals caught in the dragnet of minor offenses. He took on cases that established firms deemed too small, too unprofitable, or too complex due to language and cultural barriers. He worked tirelessly, late into the night, poring over documents, researching obscure precedents, driven by the belief that justice, in its purest form, should be accessible to everyone, not just those who could afford the highest fees. Yet, even in his own practice, the shadows of systemic abuse lingered. When dealing with court clerks, he often found himself waiting longer, his requests processed slower than those of his white colleagues. Judges, not as overtly hostile as Langston, still sometimes carried an air of mild skepticism, requiring him to present his arguments with an extra layer of precision and evidence that was not demanded of others. He noticed that the legal aid he applied for on behalf of his indigent clients often faced more scrutiny, more delays, and more rejections than applications submitted by well-connected legal aid organizations. He saw the subtle eye rolls from opposing counsel, the way they would sometimes talk down to him, or simplify legal terms as if he couldn't comprehend them. One particularly galling incident involved a property dispute where Malcolm represented a low-income family facing eviction by a large real estate developer. During a preliminary hearing, the developer's lawyer, a man old enough to be Malcolm's father, chuckled during Malcolm's presentation. "Mr. Rivers," he drawled, "while your zeal is commendable, this is hardly a matter for a novice. Perhaps you should stick to smaller claims." The judge, a relatively young woman, had merely cleared her throat, offering no rebuke. It was a calculated slight, a public dismissal of his competence and experience, designed to diminish him in the eyes of his clients and the court. Malcolm felt the familiar clenching in his stomach, the well-worn path of anger and frustration. He knew these subtle attacks were meant to wear him down, to make him question his place, to push him back into the shadows. He remembered a conversation with an older black lawyer he admired, a man who had navigated these waters for decades. "They won't always use slurs," Malcolm, the elder lawyer, had advised, his voice raspy with experience. "Sometimes it's just a sigh. Sometimes it's a raised eyebrow. Sometimes it's the quiet assumption that you're less capable, less serious. The system doesn't always scream racism. Often, it just whispers, and those whispers are often harder to fight than the shouts." Malcolm had taken those words to heart, sharpening his senses, learning to identify the whispers, to understand their insidious power. He continued to push, to challenge, to endure. He built a reputation for meticulous preparation, for unwavering advocacy, for a deep ethical commitment to his clients, regardless of their ability to pay. He became known as the lawyer who took on the cases no one else wanted, the one who fought for the forgotten. He understood that every small victory, every successful defense against an unjust eviction, every piece of evidence painstakingly unearthed, was a defiant act against the systemic forces that sought to minimize him and others like him. His personal ambition had evolved into a broader mission, a silent daily resistance against the subtle yet pervasive discrimination woven into the fabric of the justice system. The courtroom, even with its quiet biases, became his arena for incremental, hard-won change, the simmering frustration of daily microaggressions, the silent battles against systemic bias, had been Malcolm's constant companion. But the current trial, the one with Judge Langston, was different. It wasn't a whisper, it was a roar, a public spectacle of contempt that demanded a direct response. The case itself was a high-profile civil rights matter, a lawsuit filed by a collective of families from a historically black neighborhood against a powerful city development corporation. The corporation was accused of eminent domain abuse, forcibly acquiring properties at laughably low prices under the guise of urban renewal, displacing an entire community that had lived there for generations. Malcolm had taken on the case pro bono, his heart aching for the injustice, recognizing the echoes of his own past struggles in the systemic displacement of an entire people. His opposing counsel, veteran lawyers known for their aggressive tactics and close ties to the establishment, had underestimated him from the start. They saw a young, self-represented black lawyer and assumed an easy victory. Their initial strategy was to overwhelm him with procedural motions, technical delays, and mountains of paperwork. A common tactic designed to financially exhaust and emotionally break independent attorneys. Malcolm, however, had anticipated this. He worked around the clock, fueled by strong coffee and an unyielding sense of purpose. He meticulously reviewed every document, cross-referenced every statute, and uncovered every inconsistency. The first act of resistance, subtle yet powerful, came during the initial discovery phase. The opposing counsel had withheld crucial documents, claiming they were privileged or irrelevant. Malcolm, relying on his intimate knowledge of the neighborhood and the community's deep trust in him, had already pieced together fragments of information from displaced residents, old property deeds, faded photographs, even anecdotal accounts of city officials offering lowball deals. He knew the withheld documents were vital to proving the corporation's predatory practices. One evening, after another grueling day of facing dismissive glances and snide remarks, Malcolm found himself at a small community center in the displaced neighborhood. He was meeting with Mrs. Estelle Green, an elderly woman whose family home, a beautiful Victorian, had been among the first targeted for acquisition. Mrs. Green, frail but with eyes that sparkled with fierce resolve, had lived in that house her entire life. She brought out a dusty shoebox filled with old letters, faded newspaper clippings, and a crumpled ledger. "My daddy, he kept everything," she said, her voice soft. "He always said, 'Documentation is liberation, son.'" Among the papers, Malcolm found a forgotten receipt for a major renovation project on Mrs. Green's house, dated just months before the city declared the area blighted. And then he found it, a series of meticulously recorded entries in the ledger detailing clandestine meetings between a city councilman and a representative from the development corporation, well before any public announcements of the urban renewal project. The entries, written in his father's precise hand, included dates, names, and even cryptic references to pre-acquisition agreements. It was not just a smoking gun, it was a meticulously drawn map of conspiracy. Armed with this, Malcolm filed a motion to compel, demanding the immediate production of the withheld documents. The opposing counsel scoffed. "Your Honor," one of them, Mr. Harrison, stated, "Mr. Rivers is on a fishing expedition. These are confidential business records, and his claims are speculative at best." Judge Langston, still harboring his disdain for Malcolm, leaned forward. "Mr. Rivers, do you have concrete grounds for this request, or are you merely grasping at straws?" His tone was dismissive, designed to publicly embarrass Malcolm. Malcolm, however, stood tall. "Your Honor, we possess compelling evidence that suggests a deliberate pattern of concealment and collusion. We have witness testimony and documentation indicating that the corporation and certain city officials engaged in discussions regarding property acquisitions long before any public condemnation notices were issued. Specifically, we have records showing a preemptive effort to devalue properties in the affected area, followed by suspiciously low appraisals." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And Your Honor, we are prepared to present this evidence to the court if the requested documents are not produced." His calm, unwavering delivery, coupled with the hint of concrete evidence, caught the judge off guard. Langston's brow furrowed. He eyed Malcolm with a flicker of something new, not respect, but perhaps a grudging curiosity. The opposing counsel exchanged nervous glances. They hadn't expected Malcolm to have any tangible proof. The judge, reluctant to appear biased, especially given the public interest in the case, conceded. Very well, Mr. Rivers, the court will grant your motion to compel. The requested documents are to be produced within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in severe sanctions. This was Malcolm's first victory, a small but significant crack in the monolithic wall of the opposition. It wasn't just a legal win, it was a personal triumph. He had faced down the disdain, the dismissal, the subtle mockery, and, through meticulous preparation and the unwavering support of the community, he had forced the system to yield. Mrs. Green, sitting in the gallery, gave him a small, knowing nod, a silent affirmation of his courage. He knew this was just the beginning, but it was a crucial start, a testament to the power of unwavering resolve and the quiet strength drawn from the very community he sought to protect. The courtroom buzzed with an unusual energy as the trial entered its climactic phase. The ordered production of documents had been a significant blow to the defense, forcing the Development Corporation to reveal a trove of internal communications and financial records that painted a damning picture. Malcolm, now armed with irrefutable evidence, felt a surge of adrenaline, his years of quiet struggle culminating in this moment. The public gallery was even more crowded than before, a growing wave of community members joining the journalists and curious onlookers. Lena Rivers, her eyes shining with a fierce pride, sat in her usual spot, an anchor in the storm. Malcolm began his cross-examination of the corporation's CEO, Mr. Silas Thorne, a man whose polished demeanor barely masked a ruthless business acumen. Thorne, initially confident, grew visibly uneasy as Malcolm meticulously laid out the facts. One by one, Malcolm displayed a large projection of an internal memo, obtained through the compelled discovery, clearly detailing a strategy to aggressively devalue target properties months before any public announcement of the urban renewal project. Mr. Thorne, Malcolm's voice was clear, cutting through the silence. Can you explain why your company was discussing aggressive devaluation of properties in the West End neighborhood in January, when the city council didn't even propose the urban renewal plan until July? Thorne stammered, attempting to deflect. That memo was an internal preliminary discussion, merely exploring various market scenarios. It was speculative. Malcolm pressed on, unyielding. Speculative, but Thorne, or a deliberate, calculated scheme to drive down property values, enabling your company to acquire land at a fraction of its true worth, effectively robbing families of their generational wealth. He then presented a series of recorded phone calls, also obtained through discovery, between Thorne's chief financial officer and a city appraiser, where the appraiser was explicitly instructed to use a depressed valuation model for properties in the West End. The calls, played for the entire courtroom, sent a ripple of gasps through the gallery. The evidence was irrefutable. The opposing lawyers, Mr. Harrison and his colleague, began to object frantically, citing hearsay and misinterpretation. But Judge Langston, though initially reluctant, had to acknowledge the weight of the evidence. His usual dismissive air had been replaced by a growing disquiet, his eyes fixed on the projections, then on Thorne's increasingly pale face. The plot twist was unraveling before his very eyes. The seemingly straightforward, eminent domain case was revealing itself to be a brazen land grab, orchestrated through corruption. Malcolm then turned to the boy Tumdwan, his voice resonating with conviction. Members of the jury, this is not merely a technical dispute over property lines. This is about a fundamental betrayal of trust, a systematic exploitation of a community, and the deliberate dismantling of lives for corporate profit. He then called Mrs. Estelle Green to the stand. Her frail appearance belied her powerful testimony. She recounted the history of her family's home, the vibrancy of the neighborhood, and the deceptive tactics used by the corporation's agents. She spoke of the emotional toll, the sense of betrayal, her voice trembling but clear. They told us it was for progress, she said, her gaze sweeping over the jury. But it was just for greed. They tried to make us feel like our homes were worthless, like we were worthless. Malcolm presented her father's ledger, the meticulous entries detailing the clandestine meetings. He connected the dates in the ledger to the internal memos and phone calls. The narrative was becoming undeniably clear, a long-standing conspiracy, meticulously planned and executed. Judge Langston, who had maintained a facade of impartiality, now found his composure cracking. He had dismissed Malcolm, laughed at him, but the evidence was overwhelming. He saw the faces of the jury, their expressions shifting from polite attention to open dismay and anger. He saw the murmuring in the gallery, the flashes of camera phones, the intense scribbling of journalists. This case was exploding, and his initial prejudice was now dangerously close to being exposed as a dereliction of his judicial duty. The climactic moment arrived when Malcolm presented a final piece of evidence, a signed agreement between the Development Corporation and a shell company, revealing that the urban renewal land was already secretly earmarked for luxury condominiums, not for the promised public facilities. This was the ultimate betrayal. The raw, undeniable proof of deceit. The agreement was dated before the first public hearing on the urban renewal project. Silas Thorne, cornered, visibly wilted. His confident sneer evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer panic. The opposing lawyers were silent, their objections dying on their lips, their faces a mixture of shock and resignation. Judge Langston slammed his gavel, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes, previously filled with scorn for Malcolm, now blazing with a mixture of anger and dawning realization directed at Thorne. He looked at Malcolm, a long, searching gaze. The judge had been complicit in the subtle system that sought to suppress Malcolm, to deny his legitimacy. But the undeniable truth, presented with such undeniable clarity, had pierced through his own biases. He had to concede. The evidence was simply too strong to ignore. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on the judge, anticipating his reaction to the unfolding drama. The dramatic revelation of a systemic injustice that Malcolm, the lawyer he had scorned, had so brilliantly exposed. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, a palpable void created by the weight of Malcolm's damning evidence. Judge Langston sat motionless, his gaze fixed on Silas Thorne, who now looked like a man utterly exposed. The polished veneer of power had crumbled, revealing the predatory greed beneath. The collective gasp from the gallery was almost a physical entity, reflecting the shock and outrage of the public finally witnessing the full extent of the deception. Then, slowly, Judge Langston turned his gaze from Thorne to Malcolm. His expression was no longer one of scorn or dismissiveness, but of a profound, unsettling realization. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench, and in a voice that was unexpectedly quiet, almost a whisper, he addressed Malcolm. "Mr. Rivers," he began, his voice devoid of its earlier condescension. "The evidence you have presented, it is compelling, disturbingly so." He paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath, as if physically processing the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. It paints a picture, not merely of aggressive business practices, but of a deliberate, coordinated effort to defraud, an abuse of power that strikes at the very heart of public trust. He looked directly at the jury, his eyes sweeping across their faces, noting their expressions of shock and anger. "Members of the jury," he continued, his voice regaining some of its authority, but now tinged with a solemn gravitas. "You have heard the testimony. You have seen the documents. The court will ensure that justice is served." He then turned back to Thorne and his legal team, his eyes now blazing with controlled fury. "Mr. Thorne, this court finds sufficient grounds to refer this matter to the district attorney's office for a full criminal investigation into charges of fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering." A collective murmur rippled through the gallery as Thorne's face drained of all color, his lawyer frantically whispering in his ear, Judge Langston slammed his gavel, the sound definitive, final. Furthermore, he declared, his voice booming with renewed power, this court orders a freeze on all assets of the Development Corporation pending the outcome of the criminal investigation and a full restitution assessment for the affected families. The properties acquired under duress will be held in a trust, and the evictions are hereby nullified, effective immediately. A wave of spontaneous applause erupted in the gallery, quickly silenced by the bailiffs. But the message was clear: the community had seen justice. The consequences unfolded swiftly. News vans swarmed the courthouse steps. Journalists, whose initial reports had often echoed the judge's dismissive tone, now clamored for interviews, their notebooks overflowing with details of the corporation's downfall. Silas Thorne was arrested outside the courthouse, handcuffed and led away by stern-faced officers. A stark image of corporate arrogance brought low. His opposing lawyers, visibly shaken, issued terse no-comment statements, their once impeccable reputations now severely tarnished. The community, once fragmented by displacement and despair, began to respond with a powerful sense of unity and vindication. The families who had lost their homes, many of whom were present in the courtroom, embraced each other, tears of relief and joy streaming down their faces. Mrs. Estelle Green, her eyes brimming, walked slowly toward Daddy Malcolm, taking his hand and squeezing it tightly. "You did it, son," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You truly did it." The story became a national sensation. Local news channels ran continuous coverage, and major networks picked up the story, highlighting Malcolm Rivers, the young self-taught black lawyer who had single-handedly exposed a massive corporate and political scandal. Social media exploded with praise for Malcolm, his name trending, his calm demeanor and brilliant legal strategy lauded across platforms. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, a hunger for real justice satisfied by the dramatic reversal in the courtroom. People expressed their outrage at the systemic injustice exposed, and their admiration for Malcolm's courage and intellect. Even Judge Langston, in an unprecedented move, addressed the press outside the courthouse. His voice was somber, stripped of its former arrogance. "Today," he stated, looking directly into the cameras, "we witnessed a profound demonstration of legal brilliance and unwavering integrity. Mr. Malcolm Rivers is a legal genius. His meticulous work, his unyielding pursuit of truth, has uncovered a grave injustice. I commend his dedication, and I publicly acknowledge the immense service he has rendered to justice and to this city." The words, coming from the very man who had publicly ridiculed him, were a powerful testament to Malcolm's victory, not just in the case, but in shattering the judge's own ingrained biases. The courtroom, which had once fallen silent in mockery, now fell silent in awe. The initial public humiliation had been irrevocably transformed into public honor. The courtroom, once a crucible of doubt and disdain, had been transformed into a stage for vindication. Malcolm Rivers, having meticulously dismantled the corporate facade, now stood taller than ever. His initial public humiliation by Judge Langston had been utterly eclipsed by the undeniable truth he had brought to light. The judge's public declaration of Malcolm as a legal genius resonated not only within the hallowed halls of justice, but also echoed across national airwaves and social media. The aftermath of the trial was a whirlwind. Malcolm, always focused on the quiet work of justice, was thrust into the spotlight. News channels, which had previously given minimal attention to the procedural elements of the civil rights lawsuit, now ran continuous segments on the lawyer who silenced the judge. His face, once a symbol of quiet determination, became a beacon of hope for many. His modest office, once frequented by individuals seeking help with small claims, was now inundated with calls and letters from across the country, from communities facing similar eminent domain abuses to individuals seeking legal counsel for various forms of systemic discrimination. He began rebuilding not just his practice, but also a platform for broader awareness. He accepted invitations to speak at universities, community centers, and legal conferences. His talks were not bombastic or self-aggrandizing. Instead, they were clear, direct, and filled with a quiet passion. He shared a story, detailing the subtle forms of prejudice he had faced, the condescending remarks, the closed doors, the implicit biases that permeate the legal system. He spoke of the importance of vigilance, of documentation, and of persistent evidence-based advocacy. "They try to wear you down," he would say, his voice resonating with conviction, "to make you believe you don't belong. But every time you stand firm, every time you expose their tactics, you pave the way for someone else." Social media, which had initially buzzed with reactions to the courtroom drama, now became a powerful tool for Malcolm to spread his message. He launched a campaign, Justice for All, using his newfound recognition to highlight ongoing civil rights struggles. He used his platforms to share stories of other communities battling eminent domain abuse, of individuals fighting racial discrimination in housing, employment, and the justice system. He offered clear, actionable advice on how to identify and challenge subtle forms of discrimination, emphasizing the power of collective action and digital advocacy. His posts, often concise and impactful, included links to resources, legal aid organizations, and petitions for change. The public response was overwhelming. People shared their own experiences of discrimination, creating a vast, interconnected network of support and solidarity. The movement gained significant traction, fueled by Malcolm's authentic voice and the tangible proof of his courtroom victory. His mother, Lena, became his silent partner, always present, her pride evident in her unwavering support. She would often accompany him to speaking engagements, her mere presence a testament to the journey he had taken. Malcolm's story, amplified by media coverage and social media, began to inspire a wider awakening. People started questioning established norms, recognizing the subtle patterns of discrimination they had once dismissed as isolated incidents. Discussions about implicit bias, systemic inequality, and the need for legal reform became more prevalent in mainstream conversations. The success of the Justice for All campaign led to tangible changes. Legal aid organizations reported an increase in pro bono inquiries from young lawyers inspired by Malcolm's example. Legislation was proposed, aimed at tightening eminent domain laws and increasing accountability for corporate and municipal actors. Malcolm, now an undeniable force for change, became a trusted voice in these legislative discussions. His lived experience giving weight to his legal expertise, his public impact was undeniable, a testament to how one individual, when armed with truth and unwavering resolve, could spark a movement. The wave of public recognition and legislative action continued to swell, carrying Malcolm Rivers far beyond the confines of a single courtroom. The Justice for All campaign, initially a digital rallying cry, blossomed into a national movement. Fundraisers were held, dedicated to providing legal aid to underserved communities. And Malcolm, once a lone voice, found himself at the forefront of a growing chorus demanding systemic change. His work was not about revenge, but about reformation, about ensuring that what happened to the West End families, and to himself, would serve as a catalyst for a more equitable future. The ultimate testament to the public impact of his work came months later, during a special ceremony held at the city's historic convention center. The event, spearheaded by community leaders and supported by a diverse coalition of activists, was ostensibly to honor those who had fought for the West End community, but it was Malcolm, undeniably, who was the central figure. Thousands attended, from the families whose homes he had saved, to newfound supporters from across the country, to prominent legal figures, and even local politicians who had once remained silently complicit. As Malcolm walked onto the stage, a reverent silence fell over the vast hall, followed by a thunderous standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. His mother, Lena, was in the front row, her eyes shining with unshed tears, a quiet smile gracing her lips. He looked out at the sea of faces, faces etched with gratitude, relief, and renewed hope. He saw Mrs. Estelle Green, now back in her beautifully restored Victorian home, her face radiant with a peace she hadn't known in years. He saw the jury members from his trial, some of whom had personally reached out to commend him. And then, surprisingly, he saw Judge Edward Langston, seated discreetly in the back row, his silver hair a distinctive gleam in the dimmed lights. Langston's expression was unreadable, but his presence alone spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of Malcolm's profound impact, and perhaps a quiet atonement for his own initial prejudice. When the applause finally subsided, Malcolm approached the podium. His voice, usually calm and composed, held a tremor of emotion as he began to speak. "Tonight," he said, his words amplified by the sound system, "we are not just celebrating a victory in a courtroom. We are celebrating the power of truth, the resilience of community, and the unwavering belief that justice is not a privilege, but an inherent right for all." He spoke of the families whose lives had been upended, of the quiet dignity of those who had refused to be silenced, and of the collective strength that had ultimately prevailed against powerful, entrenched interests. He reiterated his belief that the system, while flawed, could be made to work, but only if courageous individuals were willing to challenge its biases, to expose its hidden injustices. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "My journey," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "began with a laugh of dismissal, of prejudice, of contempt. It was meant to diminish me, to make me question my place." But what that judge, and indeed what a system built on unspoken biases, failed to understand is that such moments do not break us. They forge us. They temper our resolve. They illuminate the path we must walk. He looked briefly toward the back, a subtle, unspoken acknowledgement of Langston's presence. Sometimes, the greatest victories are not just about winning a case, but about awakening consciousness, about changing hearts and minds, one truth at a time. The resolution of the West End case was, indeed, inspiring. Not only were the families fully compensated, but the land was officially designated as a community trust, managed by the residents themselves, ensuring that the neighborhood's unique cultural heritage would be preserved for generations. The Development Corporation, facing crippling fines in a criminal investigation, declared bankruptcy, its executives facing lengthy prison sentences. The ripple effect was profound. Similar class action lawsuits were filed across the country, citing the West End case as precedent, leading to a nationwide reevaluation of eminent domain laws and a greater scrutiny of corporate development projects. Malcolm Rivers was not just a lawyer. He had become a symbol. He continued his work, expanding Justice for All into a fully fledged nonprofit legal organization, dedicated to fighting systemic injustices wherever they arose. He was offered positions at prestigious law firms, even a potential judgeship, but he politely declined, choosing instead to remain rooted in the community, to continue the fight from the ground up. His final message, delivered that night, echoed through the halls of justice and into the public consciousness. Do not let the whispers of prejudice silence your voice. Do not let the closed doors deter your path. For every time you are underestimated, every time you are dismissed, remember that you carry the power to expose the truth. And when the truth is finally spoken, when evidence triumphs over bias, even the most skeptical will have no choice but to listen. And then, the courtroom and indeed, the world will fall silent, not in contempt, but in awe of what justice, truly pursued, can achieve. The crowd erupted again, a tidal wave of applause and cheers, acknowledging not just the end of a dramatic story, but the beginning of a profound and lasting legacy of change.